This sewing project is one of my experiments with no pattern sewing. And what do I mean by no pattern sewing? I mean not using an existing pattern, not having to take 20 steps to draft the shape of a bodice, not having to print pattern pieces, and no pattern piecing. I'm going to be drafting my pattern pieces using only two things: simple shapes and my body measurements. Hello and welcome back to my DIY and style channel. I've done this type of no pattern sewing projects in the past, and today I'm going to be trying to make an open front cardigan in a knit fabric from just mostly rectangles. In this video, I'm going to be going through the process of taking my body measurements, calculating the sizes of the rectangles, and sewing the cardigan. At the end of the video, I will also highlight some of the things to consider if you're thinking about making this cardigan for yourself, or if you are thinking about making it in a different type of fabric. So here's how my open front cardigan is going to come together. I'm going to have one back piece, two front panel pieces, two arm pieces, and one collar piece. Before drafting my rectangles, I took the following body measurements: shoulder to mid-hip. Now this is basically the length of the cardigan. I took my measuring tape and I started from my shoulder and ended somewhere in the middle of my hips and my waist. Basically, the end point should be wherever you want your cardigan to end. So if you want a cropped version of the cardigan, end somewhere around your waist. And if you want a dress length cardigan, then you should measure the length from your shoulder to your knees. Make sure your measuring tape goes over the fullest part of the front of your body, be it your waist or your tummy. Next, I also took the measurement of the length from one shoulder to another, and then the length of my shoulder to the bottom of my neck, the length from my shoulder to my wrist, and then I measured my bicep circumference by wrapping the measuring tape around the thickest part of my upper arms. And finally, I also took the measurement of my wrist circumference. So the back piece is a big rectangle that kind of looks like this, and the width of this rectangle is the length of the shoulder to shoulder plus 1 inch for ease and seam allowance. The length of this rectangle is the length from the shoulder to my mid-hip plus 1 inch of hem allowance and seam allowance. The front of the cardigan is made up of two rectangles. The width of this rectangle is the length of the shoulder to the neck plus 1 inch for ease and seam allowance. The length of this rectangle is the length of the shoulder to the mid-hip plus 1 inch hem allowance and seam allowance. So the pattern piece for the sleeve isn't technically a rectangle, and we're going to need 3 measurements, or I guess like 3 numbers to get the right shape. We're going to have the length, we're going to have width number 1, which is bicep circumference plus 1 inch ease and seam allowance, and we're going to have width number 2, which is the wrist circumference plus 1 inch for ease and seam allowance. So to draw this shape, I started off by drawing a rectangle with the length and width number 1. Then I marked out the middle of the other short edge, measured out width number 2, and then drew a diagonal line to get this shape that I need to make the sleeves. And finally, we have the collar piece. The collar piece is basically a super long and skinny rectangle. I cut it in 2 because I didn't have quite enough fabric to cut one singular long skinny rectangle. The length of this rectangle is this. I wanted my finished collar to be 3 inches wide, so my final measurement for the width is 6 inches plus seam allowance. Okay, I promise you the math was actually the hardest part of the sewing project. Putting this cardigan and sewing it up was actually pretty straightforward. For this sewing experiment, I'm using a remnant piece of fabric that a fellow sewing friend sent me. It's a loose, slinky, ribbed knit with a pretty good drape and a nice stretch of at least 50%. And now it's time to start sewing. Since I don't have a serger, I'm only sewing this on my home sewing machine. And as always, when sewing with knits, I make sure I use a stretch or ballpoint needle, and I also use a walking foot to prevent the fabrics from stretching out while sewing. I started off by sewing the shoulder seams first. I placed the front and back pieces right sides together, matching them at the raw edges, and then sewed the short edge of the front piece to the back piece. Next, I attached the sleeves to the cardigan. I folded the sleeve piece in half lengthwise and marked out the middle point along the wider end of the sleeve. Then I placed this wider end of the sleeve with the cardigan body right sides together, matching the midpoint with the shoulder seam in the previous step. I stitched both sleeve pieces on with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and here's how it looks right now. After that, I sewed the underarms and side seams of the cardigan together. I folded the cardigan along the shoulder seams right sides together and stitched all along the underarm seam and the side seam for both left and right sides of the cardigan. And then again, I trimmed the seam allowance in half. I guess if you're using a serger to sew this up, you will be finishing your seam allowance as you are sewing. Sometimes for different projects that I'm sewing with the knit fabric, I may or may not finish it with a zigzag stitch, but this knit fabric in particular really does not unravel at all. So I just found it kind of unnecessary to go through the extra step of sewing zigzag stitches. So yeah. And over here, I decided to do a little preliminary try-on. Okay, so while doing the preliminary try-on, I realized that the fit of this cardigan is a lot more snug than I thought it would be based on my calculations. And I am just quickly realizing that I might have made the mistake of using straight stitches instead of zigzag stitches. I usually do use zigzag stitches when sewing with knits, and I don't know why. I just thought that I didn't need that for this cardigan because I really honestly thought it was going to be a much looser fit. But it's not going to be like so tight where the moment I breathe in, it's going to snap. So you see at the end of the video. So for this final stitch on for the collar, I am going to be using tiny zigzag stitches and just move on from there. Next, I sewed the two collar pieces right sides together along the short edge to make one super long collar piece. Then I folded the collar in half lengthwise with the wrong sides together and pin it onto the cardigan, matching the center of the collar to the center back of the cardigan. Now this is where it got a little messy because I guess I didn't plan my sewing steps enough. I realized I needed to sew the hem of the cardigan before sewing the collar on. And for some reason, I had also cut the collar piece a little too long. So I just decided to cut off the extra fabric that I didn't need, and I left just 3/8 inch over here for seam allowance for sewing. Okay, I'm just gonna backtrack here a little bit. Now, notice this part where I didn't sew the collar onto the cardigan all the way. I left about 1/2 inch worth of collar unstitched just so I could fold the seam allowance of the ends of the collar inwards. And once I folded the seam allowance inwards, I stitched the rest of the collar onto the cardigan with a zigzag stitch. And then finally, I hand stitched the opening closed with my favorite, most versatile hand sewing stitch, the ladder stitch. So I finished hand sewing this bottom bit of the cardigan. Now all I'm left with is sewing the hem of the sleeves, and then it's gonna be the moment of truth. So I started off thinking that I was gonna have a loose-fitting open front cardigan, but it ended up fitting a lot more snugly than I originally thought it would be. But I guess this type of fit is really more like my style, so I guess it didn't turn out to be such a big mistake after all. So if you're thinking about making this cardigan but with more ease built in, then definitely consider adding more ease to your rectangles. For this project, I used an ease of 1 inch throughout, so I would recommend having an ease of 2 to 3 inches if you're using a knit fabric, and if you're using a non-stretchy woven fabric, I will say go up to at least 4 inches worth of ease. Let me know your preferred fit of a cardigan in the comments below. For most of my sewing for this cardigan, I was using straight stitches because I really thought it was going to be a much looser fit. But once I realized how close fitting it was going to be, I immediately switched to zigzag stitches, and I'm glad that I was able to use zigzag stitches for 2 key areas. Number one, the hem of the cardigan, because I knew that I would want to be able to tie the ends of the cardigan on the front in a little knot for a different look sometimes. So for that, I would need the hem of the cardigan to stretch around my waist. And number two, the hem of the sleeves, because I also knew that I would want to be able to roll up my sleeves closer to my elbows, and for that I would need the hem of the sleeves to be a little stretchy as well. If I could go back again, I think I would also want to consider reducing the finished width of the collar. So this is about 3 inches. I think I would want to maybe make it just 1 or 2, maybe 1.5 or 2 inches. This feels just a little bit too wide, but I guess it gives like a different styling option of having the collar kind of like rolled down like this. So I hope you've enjoyed this little sewing experiment. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, and if you want to try another no pattern sewing project, perhaps something that's a little bit more warm weather appropriate, then definitely check out my DIY Kaltagaya top sewing project. I go through the same process of taking your body measurements, drawing out the pattern, and sewing the top in the video. So I know I haven't been super consistent with my videos. I have just been busy with designing and sewing for Nomi patterns, trying to come up with more designs and patterns of my own, and just trying to have a better work-life balance. But I'm super excited about summer. I'm gonna try to be super focused and super disciplined. We'll see. Anyway, thank you so much for sticking around. I appreciate you being here so much, and I will see you in the next one. Bye! The moment of truth. Yes! I did it!